You're listening to the Health Courage Collective podcast, episode 13, Shut Your Mouth, part 2. That probably should have been part 1. Welcome to the Health Courage Collective podcast, the show for women who are too busy to slog through hours of generalized, inapplicable, and often contradictory health information, but too smart to ignore that a few minutes of focused attention now can prevent years of suffering in the future. I'm your host, Christina Hackett, a pharmacist who doesn't want you to live on prescriptions, a certified coach specifically trained to maximize your potential, and a compulsive learner obsessed with preventative, cutting-edge, holistic, and integrative medicine. I'm on a mission to increase your physical and mental resilience so you can fearlessly look forward to your next 40-plus limitless years. Your time is now. Let's go. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to spend a few minutes talking with you today. I hope you're having a good day so far. We are continuing on with our discussion about the astonishing power of something as basic as breathing. If you haven't listened to part 1, which probably should have been part 2, you can go back and do that next. We talked about how since breathing is automatic, it would seem like our body would naturally know how to do it optimally, but actually, most of us don't. We talked about Patrick McKeown, who wrote the book, The Oxygen Advantage, and how he said that the biggest obstacle to your health and fitness is a rarely identified problem, chronic overbreathing. Remember, just like there is an optimal amount of food to eat and water to drink in a day, there is also an optimal amount of air to breathe in a day, and most of us are breathing too much. Overbreathing contributes to lethargy, weight gain, sleeping problems, respiratory conditions, mental health struggles, and heart disease. Crazy, right? Here's a pop quiz if you listened to the last episode. What is the Bohr effect? Do you remember? It's that the hemoglobin in our blood carries oxygen from the lungs into the tissues and cells of our body, and it is less able to release the oxygen it's carrying to fuel our cells when carbon dioxide levels are too low. Overbreathing or breathing too much air decreases our carbon dioxide level and, ironically, leads to less oxygen being released from hemoglobin into our tissues that need it. The primary goal of the oxygen advantage is to help us recalibrate our carbon dioxide levels, essentially getting us comfortable having more of it in our bodies. That way, we'll get more oxygen delivery to nourish our tissues, including our muscles, while exercising. One of the quotes I really like from Patrick McKeown is, "Endurance is relative to how well the body is prepared, and the onset of fatigue occurs when the body is pushed beyond the limits of its preparation." End quote. This is kind of obvious, right? But I like how it shows that we can make very noticeable improvements to our endurance through the simple and relatively easy exercises in McKeown's book by looking at it like a simple math equation and preparing our body to tolerate more carbon dioxide. It's really impressive what you can do with very little effort. In the Zoom call I was on with Patrick McKeown, he talked about a study that was done on 21 Australian professional rugby players who were, pretty elite athletes already. They split them into 2 groups. One group did sprint training with breath holds, oxygen advantage style, and the other group did the exact same sprint training but with normal breathing. This was just a few minutes of training a few times a week, not any kind of time-consuming program at all, just a little add-on they did during peak season. At the start of the trial, they measured a score called repeated sprintability, which is what it sounds like. How many times can you sprint this specific distance? I think it was 40 meters. Until you have nothing left. You can't do it anymore. After 4 weeks of short training sessions, the group who did normal breathing increased from 9 to 10 reps and were happy about the training and improvement they made, because in this level of athletes, fractional gains are a big deal. The group who did breath hold training increased from 9 to 15 reps in the same amount of time, just by breathing differently during those mini training sessions for only 4 weeks. Pretty cool stuff. So, a few minutes of training yourself to tolerate more carbon dioxide increases endurance and delays accumulation of lactic acid and fatigue. Patrick McKeown has a new book coming out that I think is still on pre-order, but it talks more about specific protocols for athletic training. He explained them a bit on the Zoom call I was on with him, but if that's something you're interested in, you can check out his new book, and he also has an online course. I hate sprinting in general because I'm bad at it, but I think I'd be much more willing to do it with a pulse oximeter on my finger because I love seeing actual metrics for what I'm able to do. I mentioned in the last episode the exercise that I do most frequently where you hold your breath while walking. I do that just walking around during my day and during my Wednesday morning hikes in the hills behind my house. I also have tried to be more conscious about keeping my mouth closed in general, but especially when I'm exercising. There are times when I'm really working hard and I just feel like I have to open my mouth, so I do. But the practice of keeping my mouth closed even while breathing hard has been awesome and I highly recommend it. It's wild how quickly I've been able to adapt to it. I'm sure it's a mental game, as is everything, but I enjoy knowing that I'm oxygenating my muscles more by breathing less. Have you ever had a cold that causes so much nasal congestion that you can't breathe through your nostrils at all? Since the start of the pandemic, what with all the masks, social distancing, and hand sanitizing, I haven't had a cold for probably at least 2 years at this point. But anyway, in the past, when I have, I've used Afrin nasal spray on rare occasions to make it so I could get some air in through my nose. There have been times when it opens up my nasal passages so much, it's both super awesome and a bit uncomfortable. It's a really big difference. When I'm working and breathing hard and only breathing through my nose, I get that exact same feeling. It's like everything is dilating. My airways are all opening up and it's borderline uncomfortable, but it's still good. It's amazing how noticeable the difference is. I can see now how correct training in this method can reverse asthma in some patients, because feeling your airways open up like that is really impressive. I highly recommend the book, The Oxygen Advantage, and in there he has an exercise called the nose unblocking exercise, where you can decongest your nose without Afrin. So that's a good hack to have in your tool bag for when you need it. Quick aside from your friendly pharmacist, never use Afrin for more than 3 days in a row. I've helped patients through the detox phase trying to get off it, and they say it's not enjoyable. And who wants to be addicted to nasal spray? Okay, continuing to work backward from the more high-level stuff to the basics. I had mentioned in the last episode that I like to sleep with my mouth taped shut. This is a way to make sure your mouth stays closed all night long. I never thought I was a mouth breather before, and I didn't have any symptoms of mouth breathing, but I can tell that I sleep much better when I have my mouth taped shut. For real. I only do it every other night because I feel like the tape is hard on my lips when I do it every single night, but tons of people do it every night with no problems. Sleeping with your mouth closed at night increases your focus, memory, and concentration during the day, and decreases your risk of cavities and tooth decay. I'll put a link in the show notes to a good article about mouth tape. We could talk about it for a long time. Let me know if you want to hear more about it. I'd be happy to do that. Do you remember what you learned about nitric oxide in episode 9? It's good stuff, and the body produces 25% of its nitric oxide from nose breathing, so you for sure want to get as much of that as you can. Anyone aged 3 or over can tape their mouth shut while they sleep if they want to. Children who mouth breathe during sleep tend to have abnormal facial development, misaligned teeth, and poor attention and mental processing skills, mimicking ADHD. This could be an entirely other hours-long discussion, so we'll leave that for another time. There are strips specifically made to be used as mouth tape. I have some, and when my kids want to tape their mouths shut, which they do, that's usually what I give them. They're called Somnifix. Now, if only I could convince them to want to tape their mouth shut during the day, I'd really be onto something. You can also use 3M Micropore tape, which is what I almost always do just because it's a lot less expensive. I just use the 1/2-inch wide tape, which seems like it would be too narrow, but it works perfectly for me. Most people use the 1-inch size. Last time I got it, I just buy it from the pharmacy I work at, we only had the beige, which matches my skin color pretty well. So now when I go to sleep, it looks like I'm some kind of horror movie character who doesn't have an opening for a mouth at all. It's freaky, but I like it. We know our body is influenced by our mind, but our mind is also influenced by our body. Over-breathing and upper chest breathing activate the fight or flight response, which raises stress levels and produces even heavier breathing. Patrick McEwen says in The Oxygen Advantage, stressed breathing is faster than normal, audible, produces visible movements, and often involves sighs. Many people habitually breathe in this manner every minute of every hour of every day, holding them in a perpetual state of fight or flight, with adrenaline levels high. The work of even the best stress counselors, psychologists, or psychotherapists will be limited unless they first help their patients address their dysfunctional breathing. When oxygen delivery to the brain is reduced, no amount of talking and reasoning is going to correct this deficiency. Stressed and anxious patients can only make the progress they really need when their bad breathing habits are addressed. End quote. If you know about heart rate variability, then you know that this is a measure of our parasympathetic or rest and digest nervous system. Your heart rate variability is high when you are healthy and not under stress. There are whole systems or programs you can do to teach you how to calm your psychology through controlling your physiology, specifically how you breathe. There's a book called The Healing Power of Breath that says, of all the autonomic functions of the body, only one can be easily controlled voluntarily: breathing. By voluntarily changing the rate, depth, and pattern of breathing, we can change the messages being sent from the body's respiratory system to the brain. In this way, breathing techniques provide a portal to the autonomic communication network through which we can, by changing our breathing patterns, send specific messages to the brain using the language of the body, a language the brain understands and to which it responds. Messages from the respiratory system have rapid, powerful effects on major brain centers involved in thought, emotion, and behavior. For instance, if we feel anxious, just a few minutes of coherent breathing can calm our worried mind and foster more rational, rather than impulsive, decision making. End quote. This could be a longer discussion too, but what they call coherent breathing is slower and more diaphragmatic than regular breathing, and the exhale is longer than the inhale. This is how you increase your heart rate variability and synchronize the electrical rhythms of your heart, lungs, and brain. You can rapidly decrease anxiety in the moment you're feeling it by having your body talk to your brain in the language of the body, by breathing slowly in through your nose, down to your belly, and breathing slowly out, exhaling for longer than your inhale. There are all kinds of suggestions for specifics like box breathing or count to certain numbers, but you can look up and try different things and see what works for you. I like breathing in to a count of 6, holding to a count of 2, and exhaling to a count of 8. There are also devices you can use like the Komsu and the Relaxator. Breath can potentially be a way better solution than taking anxiety medications. Okay, so all of these amazing things we're learning about breathing, and there's a lot more that we've left unsaid, all need to start with a foundation of breathing through your nose all the time. Definitely at rest and during work, but also when you're exercising to the extent that you can. You also want to breathe down into your abdomen, not from your chest. Your nose is made for breathing, your mouth is not. Your nose is created to properly slow down, directionalize, filter, condition, humidify, and warm the air that you breathe. You'll also have a better balance of correct bacteria in your mouth if you only breathe through your nose. When I first started trying to pay better attention to whether I was breathing only through my nose all the time, if I discovered myself breathing through my mouth, I would shut my mouth like all the way, causing some jaw tension. This is kind of silly and ultra basic, but just in case it helps you, the way it helped me, Patrick McEwen also wrote a children's book called Always Breathe Correctly, which I haven't read, but it has a wizard that teaches kids to put their tongue in the magic spot. The tip of your tongue should gently touch the area of the roof of your mouth just behind your front teeth. So for me, instead of thinking to clamp my mouth shut, I just think magic spot, and that's a lot more relaxing. I guess I identify better with a child's level of education about this. Okay, so you put your tongue in the magic spot, you have your lips closed, your neck's not kinked, and you want to be breathing into your abdomen, not your chest. Abdominal breathing is more efficient because the lungs are narrow at the top and wider at the bottom, so the amount of blood flow in the lower lobes of the lungs is greater than in the upper lobes. Fast upper chest breathing doesn't take advantage of the lower parts of the lungs. which limits the amount of oxygen that can be transferred to the blood and results in a greater loss of carbon dioxide, which we don't want. In his book Breath, author James Nestor says, in the 1980s, researchers with the Framingham study, a 70-year-long longitudinal research program focused on heart disease, attempted to find out if lung size really did correlate to longevity. They gathered 2 decades of data from 5,200 subjects, crunched the numbers, and discovered that the greatest indicator for lifespan wasn't genetics, diet, or the amount of daily exercise, as many had suspected. It was lung capacity. The smaller and less efficient lungs became, the quicker subjects got sick and died. The cause of deterioration didn't matter. Smaller meant shorter. But larger lungs equaled longer lives. Our ability to breathe full breaths was, according to these researchers, literally a measure of living capacity. End quote. Wow, crazy. If you don't want to deteriorate regardless of the cause, maintain your lung capacity. But remember, to bring air down into the depths of the lung, it is not necessary to take a big breath. Even the quietest of breaths will activate the diaphragm and get the air down to the base of your lungs. When you are practicing abdominal nasal breathing, you should not be able to see or hear your breath during rest. There's a legend that during Japanese samurai warrior training, they would test a soldier's readiness by holding a feather under the samurai's nose, and if his breathing moved the feather, he would be immediately dismissed. Remember, breathe light to breathe right. The Chinese philosophy of Taoism succinctly describes ideal breathing as so smooth that the fine hairs within the nostrils remain motionless. There are some good and easy exercises you can do while sitting around at rest to improve your breathing too. There is so much good information about optimizing our breathing. I know breathing is super basic, but I hope I've helped you understand why it's so important and convinced you to at least dip your toe in the pool of this vast potential for improving our health. Plus, it's free and can be easily incorporated into your regular day. When I was preparing the last episode, the part 1, I kept thinking that I needed to find this story I had heard about these 2 buddies who got their noses permanently blocked up so they could only breathe through their mouths for 10 days. Then I happened to be talking to my cute neighbor one day about breath training and her experiences, and she said she listened to the book Breath by James Nestor, and I said, oh, I haven't heard of that one. Then, preparing for this episode, I found the story of the 2 guys who had their noses plugged, and it was in the book Breath by James Nestor, and I was like, oh yeah, I do know that book, so I'm so glad she reminded me about it. The story is that in 2018, James Nestor and his friend Anders Olsen went to Stanford to have their noses 100% plugged with silicone to force them to breathe exclusively through their mouths for 10 days to see what would happen. They said it was awful. They observed decreased athletic abilities, increased heart rate variability, increased blood pressure, increased allergy symptoms, dehydration and irritation of the respiratory tract, insomnia, snoring, sleep apnea, bad breath, mental confusion, fatigue, irritation, increased stress levels, increased cortisol levels, stomach aches, and bloating. James Nestor said he still has PTSD from that experiment. Then they immediately did another experiment where they taped their mouths shut at all times except for when eating for the next 10 days. I'm going to share this study with my kids to see if I can convince them to do it. They found that all of those problems went away, and during those 10 days they developed increased lung capacity, increased diaphragm strength, reduced anxiety, improved immune system functioning, and better oxygenation of their blood. Pretty cool, and as I was rereading over that, I thought, Anders Olsen, I think I've heard of him because I'm a big fan of all Swedish people. Then I realized he's the breathing therapist who invented a device called the Relaxator, and I have one of those. I got it in my biohacking box once. So it's kind of all coming together for me, finally, which is fun. There's more to discuss, like that 70% of our daily detoxifying is through our breath, and that in women, breathing abilities are significantly altered by our hormones, so our capacity is remarkably different depending on which day of the month it is. I for sure noticed this, but I didn't understand why until now. And I definitely didn't know that breathing is a potential premenstrual syndrome treatment. Who knew? So many cool things. I'm excited to keep improving my health by improving my breathing, and I hope you are too. Next week, we're going to talk about how you don't choose your future. Come back and see what does. Until then, don't be normal. Thank you so much for tuning into the Health Courage Collective podcast. I am truly honored that you have paid me the enormous compliment of your time and attention. I would be so grateful if you would share this podcast with someone you know and subscribe so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for entertainment and information purposes only. Statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Christina Hackett and producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse events by use of information contained herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.